It's amazing you've all kind of stuck this out, which is absolutely brilliant. I'd like to introduce our final speaker for today, and then we go into the breakout sessions, and I'll explain those after Katie. I'm really delighted to invite Katie up to the stage today to present her work and her ideas about exhibition making. One thing is because I suppose Katie draws on a bit of my kind of past history of working at London College of Fashion as well, and the work around related sort of kind of multidisciplinary kind of practice and how they inform each other. So really well done for sticking it out. And let's give Katie a big cheer for last session. Thank you.
Thank you for sticking with me, but I'll try and keep it energized. So yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks very much. So just to kind of contextualize that, so I'm a journalist and an author and a futurist. So I'm head of part of a trends forecasting business, trends innovation and insights business. But I write about visual culture a lot. So really I kind of specialize in defining and predicting the key intersections between technology, brandland, including retail, pop culture, but also people's behaviours. So I kind of straddle the creative commercial divide in many ways. So I'm interested in visual culture, and I'm interested in audiences of every kind, i.e. not just the immediately very artistically literate, and also innovative practice. And I'm doing a talk today that was created especially for Future Proof, that was inspired by a talk called Exhibitionism that I did. It was a series of 4 talks for the Frieze Academy earlier in the spring. Now, the premise for that, as with this talk, was really that exhibitionism, sorry, I'm just going to move that a little bit, is more critical than ever, but of course it's a landscape where the rules of engagement are changing. And the opportunities, therefore, are really rich and exciting, including reaching these audiences beyond art enthusiasts. As I said in a piece that I wrote shortly afterwards for Frieze.com, in an era of polarised media, relentless Twitter baiting and anything-goes post-truth politics, the factually rigorous, multi-perspective and deep-dive discourses, whether things are fictional or real or a kind of mixture of the both, served up by exhibitions have really become a kind of bona fide beacon of sanity for many people now. So I've broken this down into 5 key sections. Number 1, sliding icons, reimagining legacy, the importance of failure, of stardom and hidden odysseys in the gallery space. So kind of stories of hidden identities and alternative readings of cultural legacy. Number 2, supercharging subcultures. So this is looking at everything from the radical to the everyday, the misrepresented or the marginalised. Exhibitions that can really light the touch paper for social change and showcase, culture quakes, stir wider audiences. Number 3, culture and the community. So this is looking at new blueprints for creating exhibitions where curation actually can become a quite intricate form of community outreach, if you like. It's very much about thinking of the museum or the gallery space as an in beta experimental experience. Number 4, dexterous tech, redefining curator dynamics. So this is about immersive technology that I have to look at a lot, and in things like artificial intelligence that are going to really recalibrate the experience in the exhibition space forever, including changing the visitor-curator dynamic in a potentially super positive way. And number 5, when mass culture meets fine art. So this is a little bit of an exploration of some of the concepts melding commerce, pop culture, and a critical artistic perspective, exploding the traditional boundaries between art and winning new audiences. So number 1, sliding icons, reimagining legacies. Now, there's a few reasons for talking about this, and I think partly this was touched on at the very beginning of the day, the need to witness a sense of fallibility, the kind of graft and grit and irregularity inherently tethered to the larger-than-life glories that are kind of celebrated in a lot of big exhibitions. And I think, but also applies to much smaller exhibitions. Now, this is essential, especially for young people, for an era of social media consumption and self-comparison that have really created a serious mental health epidemic. There's also a general rising hunger, however, for alternative readings of cultural history, other than the ones that we've just been handed on a plate. This is key when it comes to understanding identity. In that area, the appetite for re-examination is currently massive. Now, I think the sentiment is spotlit quite nicely here by the visual artist and broadcaster Lou Mensa. She is somebody who is the co-founder of a podcast called the Shade Podcast, which is entirely based on challenging ideas regarding race and identity. Now, what you see here is a recent Instagram post where I thought it was fascinating that she gave new government figures on participation in the arts, revealing that those who are mixed race are actually more likely to engage in the arts than any other ethnic group. You know, she said that in 2017 to 18, people from a mixed ethnic group were more likely to engage in the arts, 86.8%, compared to all other groups. Now, what's key here for me, really, is her comment on why she thinks this is. She says it's because she thinks that we connect our drive to communicate about issues regarding identity in our arts practice directly to our own experiences of searching for a sense of place within society. When you're othered, you become hypersensitive, hyper-observant to the systemic placing and labelling of identity, yours and others, and that's going to lead to a heightened need to search for your place, real or imagined, through practice. Now, I'm going to kind of come back to this railing against othering in the next section, but for now it's this idea of the searching that I want to focus on. Now, Basquiat, Boom for Real, huge show, early 2018. Now, this was certainly a game changer for the Barbican. Now, this was arguably because the curator, Eleanor Nairn, or the way that she handled the legacy. I'm thinking particularly of the kind of massive sort of sometimes foreboding ephemera that surrounded his life, the glory and the solitude, but very much the reality that she believes struck a chord with the public. You know, it was as much about his place within the gritty, precarious, very nefarious nature of New York at the time as anything else. Not to mention the way it kind of synthesized the relative madness of the time that has plenty of parallels with where we are now. Now, Nairn reveals that actually, she said, the key thing with this show for her was not about preaching to the choir. 78% of people that attended that show had never even been to the Barbican before. Even a mega show like David Bowie is featured the half-decade of kind of rampant non-success that had shaped his drive and vision. And that actually fed into the mostly non-chronological chaptering or segmentation of the accompanying book. I mean, funnily enough, Bowie was never actually involved in the show, although he was apparently watching quite literally from behind the scenes, kind of coming in through, looking from behind a mirror at times. But he allowed it to be a comment on his life from others. So in a way, the sort of antithesis of the Elton John biopic. And Broke said that, with Bowie, it was really key to show the struggles and the misses that paved the way to legendary status. Even to just show another massive show, the most recent Frida Kahlo show, Making Herself Up in London. It's notable that Gibbs and Thornley, the architects who curated the space, they had never worked on an exhibition before. So they got this huge commission. So arguably they were always slightly destined to break the rules. Matt Thornley talked to me about this, and he said, we didn't want to play up the mythologized aspects of her life. We wanted it to be about the real her. We and her estate had felt that she'd often been misportrayed. Key ways that was communicated in the design include the final army of one staging at the end that alluded to her atheism, the many ways that, this kind of huge sort of legion of her self-built personas, and the section in which her mannequin, unlike most shows, is actually turned away from the audience, signalling the sense of her as a private being. Or apply this idea to an institution rather than a person, as in the Wellcome Collection's Bedlam. Now, Bedlam was a show that was designed, again, tracking back to things we've heard about today, to cover a real multiplicity of voices. It reimagined this iconic institution, not just via the official documentation, the historical narratives that have been seen many times, but via lesser-known voices, including the outliers that were essential to its being. The chaos that the asylum had come to represent, and of course in many ways still does, it was tempered with this sense of sanctuary and optimism inherent to the original meaning. However, perhaps more fundamental is this notion that I mentioned before of parallel readings of works that have been enshrined in cultural mythology. The Barbican's Modern Couples show was arguably most successful in its actually rather heartbreaking depictions of the women in many of those artistic couples who were until now very often consigned to major, sort of minor historical footnotes. Or take something like Queer and Now at the Tate, another prime example here. Now, this was curated by E.J. Scott, somebody else that I'm going to come back to shortly, who curated a walking tour of the Tate Britain in 2017-18, homing in on works chosen by different people for different reasons with a fresh perspective. Here, this slide shows the work of assistant curator Laura Castagnini's queer tour of Tate Britain's major exhibition, All Too Human, Bacon, Freud and Century of Painting Life. This was looking at everything from queer sitters to artists, from aesthetic to viewers. Now, this tour also experimented with applying a queer lens of analysis to a selection of works, some which had been placed in this kind of canon of the LGBTQ community, but some that hadn't actually been promoted as such. It's this idea of giving a kind of tremendous sense of hope and originality in this way of thinking. This is a really interesting slide I wanted to show because this notion, I think, of correcting long-held myths is also shown here in the Hyman Archive project. This has been co-helmed by a British curator called Tori Turk and James Hyman. Now, Hyman, not coincidentally, was actually used to be a scriptwriter for MTV Europe in the pre-internet 90s. He also holds the Guinness World Record book of, he's the Guinness World Record holder for the largest collections of magazines in the world. Now, I show this because this pair are currently digitizing every single magazine in their archive. Now, this is going to create a new platform that will generate royalties for those that are using the work for the first time. But it also, of course, means that all the stories are going to be digitally interlaced. Now, Turk talked to me about this, and she describes it as the 21st century black hole. It's the point, i.e. the point at which so much work was copyrighted that it only exists in print. So effectively, it's impossible to search on Google. Now, the digitization of this archive is going to make it possible to cross-reference those kind of hidden worlds and all the narratives that have been proliferated on the web, potentially revealing some very difficult scenarios, so kind of new stone-cold truths. Now, this kind of digital recalibration, a joining the dots for which AI is so incomparably good, is something that I expect to see a lot more of as a way for museums and galleries to spotlight their rare position as kind of impartial arbiters of the truth. Magazines are such a key source of information, says Turk, because they're reactive. When this hole opens up, it's going to change everything. So on to number 2, supercharging subcultures. Now, that idea of alternative histories, of puncturing these glossy veneers to track hardcore truths, is also something I want to delve into here. This is very much about the value of championing micro-movements, of spotting and relaying what I would kind of call culture quakes, roughly. Not just looking at retrospective, so very much things that as they're happening. This to me is really key to delivering the sense of relevancy that we all need to talk about. It's arguably never more valuable at a time when so many parts of society feel directly under siege, and therefore the museum or the gallery space has never been a more vital vessel for showcasing subversive or perhaps just inadequately voiced narratives. So, of course, what's subversive and what's in need of support is always going to change. But for now, let's take the Museum of Transology. Now, this was a museum purely focused on transgenderism. It's a really central case to this. Now, this was initiated in 2008, and it showcases items that were submitted, they were submitted rather than procured. Here are some rather remarkable images from the show that aim to show a very kind of holistic view of transitioning. Quite remarkably in many ways, despite gender identity being a huge area of interest in artistic practice, E.J. Scott revealed that no major institution would touch this in any way at the time. In his words, the museum is taking ownership for the disenfranchised to showcase not only pain and despair, but also narratives of joy, desire, and ecstasy. As Frances Corner, OBE, formerly Dean of the London College of Fashion, where the exhibition was first shown, said in her blog, 1 month into opening, the Museum of Transology has already become incredibly meaningful for many. For many in the trans community, it presents a public platform on which to air their narratives, but also for many cis visitors, it has provided an insight into the breadth of the trans experience. As Scott states, the Museum of Transology is a proactive attempt to halt the erasure of trans lives from the heritage sector. Museums have an active responsibility to create spaces to learn and think about difference, which will turn into diversity. There is, of course, a key opportunity to confront topics and issues where there is at best confusion and misrepresentation, and at worst, actually vilification. Kiss My Genders at the Hayward is another prime example, a show dedicated to overhauling widespread or undiscussed assumptions. Now, I mention this show specifically because of its capacity to push beyond cliché, to talk to far bigger topics than the one immediately shown on the page or the walls. As The Guardian art critic Jonathan Jones put it in his 5-star review of this show, it does more to contribute to the impassioned politics of identity. It touches in profound ways on what it is to be human and why we need this great river of the unfixed. What it is to be human, including the topic of transhumanism, is clearly not a topic that's going anywhere soon. Blended heritage, of course, this plays a key role in Kiss My Genders, and this is going to swell as a thematic as well. In New York, the current and third installation of the Shed Summer series of experimental art focuses on performance now, but also in the future. And this is the idea here, is to really give voice to frequently ignored blended heritage. So, for instance, things like the Indian Latin culture that exists specifically in Jackson Heights, Queens. So you can see this is very much about burrowing into a very specific area. I also wanted to show North Identity, Photography and Fashion that was curated by Adam Murray and Lou Stoppard. It's really worth a mention because although I fundamentally think that the line between celebration and fetishization can be perilously close, this was a show that involved a number of northern creatives that focused on the influence of place, of hometown and of upbringing on their own creative outputs. This idea of the positive aspects of localism, the desire not only to see ourselves represented singularly, but also as collectives that we can bond with and learn from, is proving pivotal within retail and brand culture at the moment. We've got some slides, some images here from Nike's Nike Lab in partnership with Virgil Abloh. He's the artistic director of Louis Vuitton Menswear, a co-founder of the brand Off-White. And he recently opened a pop-up giving 10 young Chicagoans the chance to get involved in a mentorship scheme. So they work with local creatives on photography and design projects, an initiative framed by public panel sessions focusing on Chicago's cultural legacy. And then you've got Sangson's new King's Cross store that is very non-transactional, very soft sell, instead focusing on local partnerships, including with Central St. Martin's and the Young Film Academy. Getting back to subcultures or collectives, especially those that are bound by pleasure, not just politics, is of course ultra relevant to UK audiences right now. Now, Tori Turk, that I mentioned before, is a great curator to review in this space because of her focus on pop culture, predominantly the melding of fashion and music, the kind of shows that are able to spur a rethink of how we identify perhaps as Brits. Her show, Super Sharp, that was co-curated with DJ and EDM producer Saul Milton of Chase and Status, focused on grime, a really key British export, if you will, seen by many inside the arts, but also way beyond the arts, as a symbol of hope and unity. But there was more with this. One of the key things identified by Turk was that a lot of subcultures have historically often been seen as being owned by men. In her show, she specifically focused also partly on grime girls. Now, this might sound obvious, but even just focusing on girls, particularly the female Gen Z voice, is of huge relevance right now. If you transpose this into Brandland, focusing on empowering girls is one of the very reasons why Vans has been catapulted into the top 10 of teens' favourite brands in the last year, specifically because of its skate clinics for girls celebrating women's skating, giving them a kind of safe space to get on board with this. That combination of music, style, and accessible dissension of accessible anarchy, if you like, is also evident in Sweet Harmony Rave Today, Saatchi's major acid house retrospective that's just finished. Now, as Jeremy Deller says in the BBC film Everybody in the Place, where he pretty much pitches rave culture as something of a leveller, this pursuit of transcending everyday life, of exiting banality via a communal experience is really key. As he told The Guardian, rave is also vital, and this is really key, I think, because it's not nostalgic. It feels as if it's actually also about the future. These are the stories, those that have kind of offer a leap forward, not just looking back, that will be capable of igniting the fascination with wider audiences and with very important regional nuances. With the last slide for this section, I wanted to track back to section 1 in terms of reconsidering new wave icons, the changing nature of exactly who is worth putting on a pedestal. Here, for instance, consider somebody like John Wright, aka Johnny Banger, who is the founder of the brand Sports Banger. Now, he's what you'd call a contemporary brand list. He's a guy from Tottenham that's using bootlegs and the inclusivity of rave culture to discuss social injustice, politics, and identity. So he did the Nike bootleg top here. Now, the work, although he would never call it that per se, he doesn't purport to be an artist, which is one of the things that's so interesting about him. This is a totally commercial business, questions authenticity as a concept. It's subversion through appropriation. It's basically a kind of piss take, but with a serious sentiment behind it. So powerful that the brand has actually crossed over now into a relatively mainstream sense of adulation. So as I said, you've got the famous kind of Nike NHS t-shirt above one of his original pieces, and a shot from a recent fashion show as part of his legitimate collaboration with Slazenger that was reviewed by Vogue and GQ. So number 3, looking closer at communities and the shows that deserve raising up or unpacking in the gallery space, of course, raises the issue of how contemporary curation can even be executed. Which brings me to this idea of a sense of outreach curation, very much aligned with the wider consumer culture where the expectation of participation, which could be physical or that could just be in terms of having an opinion that's voiced and acknowledged, is really massive. So back to the Museum of Transology, which is underpinned by this sense of anti-elitism. Now, E.J. Scott is currently in the process of working on a project that he describes as a new blueprint for curation, where he's creating a set of tools to help the communities on which these stories are founded to really get involved. So the idea here is that the Museum of Transology could, for instance, have maybe 100 different versions all over the country or the world. Not an easy thing to do. He's kind of sort of wading through this at the moment, but he fundamentally describes it as acting electively as curatorial agents, in line with the statement that I have up here, that in modern curation, participation is no longer the enemy of connoisseurship. So what I'm presenting here is really this idea of going in beta, of a work-in-progress-based show. Another reflection of wider culture, including with retail, where the finished article is increasingly becoming less interesting than being able to peek inside the process. This is an image from the This Is a Voice show by the Wellcome Collection in 2016. Now, this was an experimental collaboration about the voice at large, laughing, shouting, wavering, internal, or a lack of voice, or that which has been forcibly removed. Again, super pertinent for right now. Now, this was physical, but also conceptual, and it involved around 60 sound-based artworks. But key to this, why I'm really showing it, is that the central space actually hosted unannounced and unpolished performances. So things like opera singers coming in to experiment with the new roles that they were trying out. So it was almost this kind of sort of visibility and exposure to people in a way that would kind of educate and entertain and enthrall at the same time. It's very much thinking about it in terms of participatory art, something primed for the experiential era, but perhaps without going full Eliasson. Obviously, Olafur Eliasson being billed as the chief offender of eventifying art at the moment. Now, this is an upcoming example of the new Play Well exhibition at the Wellcome Collection that's on the cusp of launching next month, I think. And according to Andres Rosoto, who is the set designer for this is going to use materials that will require people to actually take their shoes off and understand the space itself in a very different, intimate way. It's even going to involve LARPing, the kind of adult, real-world role play, things that often run for about a weekend. So the idea here is about getting people to really viscerally experience a show, to really kind of change their perception of the space in order to foster a sort of mindset shift. The LARPing, by the way, they're working on that with an artist called Adam James, if anyone's interested. And apparently there's going to be some kind of LARPing invigilator, so quite a big operation. In a similar vein, I vaguely remember a show, perhaps the V&A's Club to Catwalk show, where you could see a fanzine actually being made in process and really digging into the things they're talking about in the most hands-on way. Now, if this didn't happen, might have not, if I may have imagined it, I think it probably should have. I mentioned some of these things before, show this idea of a very kind of different setting for the art experience, if you like. That notion of having a relaxed venue, of puncturing the rigidity of the museum or the gallery environment, of course, is an opportunity very much ripe for exploration. Now, this is Jess Toms, who I'm sure many of you will know, that she's an artist, she's a writer, and she's also the founder of Tourette's Hero. And she worked on a 2-week festival with the Battersea Arts Centre in early this year called Rest and Resistance. Now, this was focused on, but not exclusively, for the UK's disability art scene. These are some key stills from an online interview with Tom. And she says, we've been experimenting with what a relaxed venue could be. At its simplest, it flips the assumption that theatre or a gallery is still and quiet, and only for people with particular bodies or minds. We take a relaxed approach to all unless there is a clear rationale why not, to make sure that we're not just talking to the arts industry itself. Section number 4, dexterous tech, redefining curator dynamics. So that notion of participation, of rethinking the dynamic between the curator or the institution and the exhibition goer, is something that technologies, both advanced but actually also quite everyday, stuff that's very much in the here and now, will impact. One of the first real attempts at this kind of immersive rejig was the 2016 Bjork digital exhibition, part of her 2015 Vol Natura album, also known as her big Heartbreak opera. Now, this allowed visitors to actually steer their own viewing of the work. This afforded the experience a really quite thrilling sense of uniqueness. It was a direct follow-up to the 2011 Biophilia app album. That was a multimedia exploration of music, nature, and tech that comprised a suite of original music and interactive educational artworks and what she would call musical artifacts. Now, you could use Biophilia to make and learn about sound or to find out about natural phenomena, or just simply to enjoy Bjork's music if you're a fan. Now, this is a concept that still presents a very interesting precedent for the museum communication experience in terms of these critical takeaway experiences, i.e. how the visitor continues to connect and possibly even interact with the institution long after they've left the show. So it's thinking about these kind of very creative uses of data to continue that conversation. As Andrew Melchior, the Chief Technical Advisor on the Bjork Digital Immersive Exhibitions show, which is still an ongoing practice, says, we're trying to enhance the pleasure or the immersion from the notion of a messianic third space to living archives. We're looking to create a deeper synchronization between the art and the audience. Now, this tech is, of course, moving on. Here you see the aptly named Museum of Future Experiences, an immersive multi-sensory experience in New York that blends immersive theatre, personalised VR. So you have people in groups of about 6 or less that they're guided through a 60-minute set, including individual analysis, audio-visual stimulation, and dreamlike VR curated, I believe, I'm not entirely sure, according to the individuals using biometrics. So it's kind of effectively using the individual as an interface. Or you've got Otherworld London. It's got 14 what they call sense-hacking immersion rooms where visitors play games, and it also has sensorial cues. You can have sort of sun on your face or the wind in your hair to heighten sensations. Now, of course, this clearly is not relevant in all circumstances, but it could be as a component where there's a narrative or a set of sensations to relay in terms that need to feel a lot more palpable than can be relayed with static images or captions. In the context of the gallery, the possibility of resuscitating an archival item or a defunct venue, of transporting visitors somewhere else in the world or back to a different time is pretty much here already. This is an extract from a piece I wrote for Forbes, for which I interviewed 2 of the team from ILM Lab. They're the immersive film division behind Disney's Lucasfilms, full of people that are both kind of effectively creative geniuses, but also technical gurus. So as Mo and Leo, its Oscar-nominated director of immersive content, says, in the not-so-different future, you'll be able to capture the real world using 3D imaging devices and then enter it at a later point virtually. You could therefore create these destinations as they were at that point in time, taking someone with you who wasn't able to be there at that point. Obviously, clearly very relevant for recreating experiences or taking people back to a particular historical moment in time. He continues, All of this work that we're doing taps into this ongoing fantasy of wanting to interact with fictional characters. We think a lot about storytelling that weaves into everyday life, applying virtual layers onto the physical world. He also reveals, and actually this was last year, so this is happening really quickly now, we're going to see conversational AI in this character-infused space very soon. So it's almost, imagine that idea of being able to be actually physically guided, perhaps, around a space by somebody who can tailor the content to you in terms of what you want to be asked, what you want to know about. Now, in pursuit of that idea of feeding characters, fictional, real, into the exhibition experience, comes this premise of using AI to codify personalities. Now, this is a process which effectively means translating a personality alongside all its kind of excellent idiosyncrasies into a virtual agent or a guide, as I just mentioned. Now, I'm going to give you a confidential example of how this is playing out in Brandland, just to flesh out how kind of real this is. So last year, British AI guru Pete Traynor helped Nike meld its encyclopedic brand Bible. This is something that was initiated way back in the 1960s, with the idiosyncrasies of key personalities of what it calls its Eakins, Nike spelt backward, which is an elite group of sneaker aficionados that it created in the 1980s to be its like kind of sneaker nerd brain. Now, they did this in order to create an ultra-nuanced Google Home skill, so a kind of a skill that would live on your smart speaker at home. So what they did is they had an AI algorithm that ingested vast binders of factual data alongside extensive psychometric testing of all these Eakins to ensure that it really behaved like them. Now, the still is apparently still under wraps, and possibly because it was so good that ethically they're working out how they kind of work this melding of man and machine. Here's another example that is also in the public domain, a bot, for want of a better word, although that seems a little bit of a cold way to describe it. Very different function that Traynor created for a man called James Dunn, a really heroic young man who was suffering from a deadly skin condition at the time, who sadly passed away earlier this year. Now, Dunn wanted Traynor to develop this for him, this kind of digital codification of his own personality to create a digital legacy, predominantly because he had a very young nephew at the time, and it was something that he wanted to create. So it would learn to express itself similarly to how he had done, and critically to present something that would outlast the confines of his very ailing body. I find this a bit difficult to look at, actually. I find it a bit emotional because I've seen it in practice. But I think it's very important to show you because it's really important in understanding the value of this kind of human technology interlace, as it's been called, the capacity not to replace but to actually extend. Let's leave that with you rather than read it out. So this last section, again, very clearly goes into that idea of blurring the lines, moving between mass and high culture for art and exhibitions that want or can transcend gallery lines. This is a prime example indicative of a major sea change, and it's Virgil Abloh's 2019 Figures of Speech retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. I might have mentioned that was Abloh's, that's actually his native city. Now, the idea with this was really to bolster his mission to shake up the art scene and spur diversity in the creative industries. The retrospective therefore displayed pieces ranging from his 2019 rug collection with IKEA to upscale off-white looks. It also had an in-exhibit off-white pop-up that was called Church and State, referencing this idea of dismantling the barriers between high and mass culture. And this is something that sold limited edition garments, but he's very aware of the number of kind of young people that really don't see that there's any place for them in art, whether it's educational institutions or in the kind of gallery, museum institutions. Now, some of the people with that pop-up could actually buy the streetwear via a drop app called Frenzy. So it was even giving remote fans access to items. So you create this kind of dual state where you have people that could actually make it to the physical space, make that pilgrimage, and then people that could connect remotely. And then, of course, they are connecting about that as well, feeding this whole situation virally. Or take another very kind of mass culture example, Selfridge's State of the Art. Selfridge is a brand that has very much always reimagined itself as a kind of populist firebrand when it comes to cultural debate. Launched a UK-wide state-of-the-arts campaign featuring the work of international artists and also a participatory events programme in tandem with galleries. This is very much about responding to the precarious states of art funding in the UK. Now, the reason I'm showing this is not to kind of highlight competition, but future collaboration in this pursuit of understanding what public art could be. It included also a podcast, a vital piece of the jigsaw in an era where, to an extent, all brands, regardless of their sense of outright commerciality, will need to consider themselves as broadcasters. The merger is also keenly evident in the way that other industries are co-opting the gallery space as their own boundaries shapeshift in the digital age. Take, for instance, Beyond the Road, curated by the famous music producer James Lavelle. This has just finished at the Saatchi Gallery as well, but I know, incidentally, that it's also looking for a new home, and actually Bristol is one of the destinations that it's potentially really keen to come to. Now, this was an immersive exhibition tracing the visual influences and cues that played a part in Lavelle's last two Uncle albums. So it featured sound design and ambient theatrics of the Punch Drunk Collective, but also the works of photographers, artists, and even filmmakers, to create this beguilingly unnerving sort of sensorial odyssey. Each space was very much treated as a kind of isolated experience in the context of the music and the visuals. As Lavelle says, I've always been about joining the dots and putting rarities next to things that are fully understood. I'm a sampler, I'm a collagist, reappropriating and connecting. This is no longer about seeing art, it's about experiencing art. Bjork's Volnakura project, whose early birds were, of course, first seen in the gallery shots that I showed, has just this month been transplanted into a gaming platform. Volnakura VR is the very first time that all the visuals made for the album can actually be found in one place, kind of bringing that gallery experience into the home. Again, I think that's more kind of key food for thought in terms of thinking how the exhibition experience can traverse the physical, the virtual, and also geographical boundaries. So to bring us full circle, I thought very immodestly that I would end on my own quote. As I mentioned at the beginning, in this era of polarised media, relentless Twitter baiting and anything goes post-truth politics, the deep dive discourses served up by exhibitions have become a bona fide beacon of sanity. For the so-called experiential generation, brilliantly researched exhibitions are fueling key cultural conversations and using art to look way beyond art. Thank you very much.